This is the second in our series of many lectures related to the church in the United States during the early national period. This time we're looking at the Second Great Awakening. First thing you need to be aware of is that the churches emerged from the Revolutionary War in a profound state of crisis. First, of course, the church had disrupted local congregations. People had been killed, church buildings had been destroyed, and regular routines disrupted. The war was particularly hard on the Episcopal Church, or the Church of England in Virginia and the South, with its ties to England. The church was disestablished by law in Virginia and around the South, which meant that the church would have to survive on its own, without taxation from the state government, and without the protection afforded by state persecution of dissenters. With disestablishment, there were no longer any dissenters. All Christian religious groups had equal status. It took somewhat longer for the Congregational or Puritan congregations in New England to lose their protected status, but over time, religious liberty and disestablishment or separation of church and state spread to the state constitutions, even in New England. Christianity was also under attack intellectually. Folks like Thomas Paine and Ethan Allen, influenced by the rationalism of the Enlightenment, published withering critiques of the beliefs that were foundational to Christian faith. In a pamphlet entitled Reason, the Only Oracle of Man, for example, in 1784, Allen declared, "In those parts of the world where learning and science have prevailed, miracles have ceased. But in those parts of it as are barbarous and ignorant, miracles are still in vogue." He obviously regarded much of the new United States as barbarous and ignorant. Thomas Paine said that the Christian religion is a parody on the worship of the sun, in which they put a man called Christ in the place of the sun and pay him the adoration originally paid to the sun. Now, recall that both of these men were prominent supporters of the Revolution and were widely read in the Revolutionary period and beyond. Partly as a result of all this, Mark Knowles says that interest in Christianity was on the decline in the beginning of the new nation, with well under 10% of the population actually holding membership in a local congregation. As I've warned previously, such a statistic surely underestimates adherence to some version of Christian belief and practice. Still, it does mean something. The relative weakness of the churches was overcome in what has been called the Second Great Awakening, which Knoll refers to as the most influential revival in the history of the United States. Like the first, it was not a single event, but a series of local revivals spread across all the states in the new nation. Knoll dates it from 1795 to 1810, but really this revival movement extends all the way through the pre-Civil War period. The first embers of this revival were carefully nurtured by a network of congregational ministers in Connecticut in the early 1790s. An important expression of that concern among congregational clergy was the work of Timothy Dwight, the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, who became president of Yale College in 1795. He was concerned when he went there to discover that many of the students there were attracted to the rationalistic deism rather than Orthodox Christianity. And in response, he preached a four-year cycle of sermons aimed at instilling the essentials of an Orthodox Christian faith. Eventually, revival swept the Yale campus, most notably in 1802, when a third of the students there were said to be converted. The most important aspect of this is that many of those students became agents for revival and reform in New England, upstate New York, and further west. Despite this important New England influence, the Second Great Awakening was largely an affair of the frontier, where itinerant missionary work by Presbyterian, Baptists, and Methodists fueled the revival. Most noteworthy are the events at Cane Ridge, Kentucky in 1801. Cane Ridge was an evangelical Protestant camp meeting organized and led primarily by a Presbyterian, James McCready, but involving Methodists and Baptists, blacks and whites. Thousands attended over a period of several days and weeks. And thousands experienced conversion, accompanied by incredible psychological and even physical manifestations. Now, while the Cane Ridge Revival was a noteworthy event in its own right, its significance has to do much more with what it represented over time. It was possibly the beginning of what went on in hundreds of places, especially on the frontier, for decades thereafter. And it provides a model, a revival model, a protracted series of meetings, a model for attempts to renew churches in America even to this day. It led to the rapid growth of the Presbyterian Church in the South, but more significantly to the growth of the Baptist and Methodist denominations across the country. Marknall has offered some interesting comparisons between the first and the second Great Awakenings. Surely there were significant similarities. Each focused on and was motivated by a profound concern for personal salvation. Both used emotional appeals and methods that appealed to the human heart and spirit rather than the head or human reason. Both were part of an international movement for Christian renewal that involved networks of evangelists from various churches or denominations. Put differently, both revivals tended to ignore theological differences that separated one denomination or movement from another. Now, there were significant differences. First, different denominations led the two periods of revival. The first, you will recall, was led by an Anglican, George Whitefield, and had tremendous influence among the Puritan or congregational churches. The second was dominated by Methodists and Baptists. Secondly, while the first awakening had minimal long-term effects on church membership, the second had a much, much more long-lasting effect. And those effects were manifest primarily in the proliferation of what historians call voluntary societies, or what we might call today parachurch organizations. That is to say, organizations with a distinctly Christian and evangelical focus, but that are separate from denominational structures of organization and authority. They are associated with no single denomination, but impact a variety of them. The Second Great Awakening resulted in the founding of the American Board for Foreign Missions in 1810, the American Bible Society in 1816, the Colonization Society in 1817 that tried to organize the sending of freed African slaves back to Africa, the American Sunday School Union in 1824, the American Tract Society in 1825, and the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance and the American Home Missionary Society, both in 1826. Another fundamental difference between the two awakenings is the theological orientation of those who led the revivals and who tried to make sense of them. The folks who led the First Great Awakening were primarily Calvinist in orientation. The second, however, was led and understood or made sense of by people who are said to have an Arminian theological orientation. Arminianism derives from the ideas of a Dutch Reformed theologian named Jacobus Arminius, 1560 to 1609, who was famous for rejecting the Calvinist idea of predestination. Arminius had a lot of influence on Baptists in Europe and in England, and among Baptists as they came to the United States. Most significantly, however, may have been his influence on John Wesley, the founder of the Methodists, whose theology is said to be Arminian. The most important contrasts between a Calvinist and an Arminian orientation are these. First, as we've already said, Calvinists emphasize predestination, and Arminians the idea that God's grace is free and available to all, that all are capable of and potentially respondents to God's offer of grace. All Protestants emphasize and affirm salvation by grace through faith. The issue that divides Calvinists and Arminians has to do with the balance between God's activity and the human response in this formula of salvation by grace through faith. Calvinists put the emphasis almost entirely on God. God, by his grace, not only makes salvation in Jesus Christ possible, God also creates human faith. Thus, God's grace is effective only for those whom God elects or chooses, and even preordains or predestines for salvation. God creates faith in those that who he has chosen. For those, God's grace is irresistible. Arminians, by contrast, regard faith as mostly a human response, aided, of course, by the Holy Spirit or by God's grace. As a result, there is no preordination or predestination to salvation. Salvation depends upon a free human response of faith to God's grace, which is available and potentially effective in all human beings, and not just those that God has supposedly foreordained or predestined for salvation. Calvinist perspective emphasizes human sinfulness. Because we are enslaved in sin, we could not be saved, we could not even have faith without the overpowering of God's grace. And for Calvinists, as for Lutherans, I think, this sense of the deep and pervasive sinfulness of human beings means that even the converted remain forever sinful. Now, Arminians also surely believe that human beings are sinful, but that sin is not so deep as to make impossible a free human response to God's grace. We are capable of responding in faith, always aided by the Holy Spirit, and more significantly, once converted, we are capable of moving on to perfection, to use John Wesley's famous phrase. What's important to recognize here is that this Arminian spirit accounts for the great personal and social reforming impulse of the Second Great Awakening and later ones. It will be folks inspired by revival faith who lead the anti-slavery movements, the temperance movements, the movements against child labor and for women's suffrage and international peace that are so influential in the 19th and even into the 20th century. Related to all this is the way in which Calvinists and Arminians understand God's law. For Calvinists, the law is simply a restraint on human sinfulness. Its primary function is to prevent chaos. For Arminians, the law points us onward toward individual and social reform, towards the sanctification of individual and social life. Well, this introduces you to the Second Great Awakening. In our next two lectures, we'll look at two of the groups that most thrive because of the Awakening, the Methodists and the Baptists. That for next time.
Thank you.